All right, today we're going to talk about something that's always kind of quietly eating away at your money: inflation. It's that invisible thing that makes every dollar you have worth just a little bit less tomorrow than it is today. And to really get a grip on its power, we have to see what happens when it goes completely off the rails. To really understand how wild this can get, let's start with this. I want you to just picture it. You walk into a store in Germany in 1923 to buy a simple loaf of bread, and the price tag says 200 billion. Sounds insane, right? But it actually happened, and it's a pretty stark reminder of what happens when inflation just spirals completely out of control. Okay, so that's the absolute extreme. For you and me, inflation usually looks a lot more, well, normal. Like this: an apple that cost you a buck 50 last year might be $2 this year. It doesn't seem like a huge deal, but that little jump, that's inflation in action. And you've got to imagine that happening with, well, thousands of different goods and services, all at the same time. So what's the connection here? How do we get from a 50-cent price jump on an apple all the way to bread costing billions? Well, it all boils down to what's happening to the value of our money itself. Okay, so here's the textbook definition. And the keywords you really got to latch onto here are sustained and general. See, this isn't about the price of avocados going up for a week because of a bad harvest. Nope. Inflation is when everything, across the board, keeps getting more expensive over a long period of time. And that, of course, leads us straight to this idea of purchasing power. It sounds fancy, but it's super simple. It's just how much stuff you can actually buy with your money. So as inflation goes up and prices for everything rise, each dollar you have buys a little bit less. Your purchasing power, well, it's shrinking. Right, so we all feel it when things get more expensive. But how do economists actually turn that feeling into a hard number you see on the news? Believe me, it's not just a guess. There's a whole system for figuring out that official inflation rate. The way they usually do it is by creating this, think of it like a virtual shopping cart, or what the pros call a market basket. And this isn't just a random bunch of stuff they throw in there. It's carefully designed to represent what a typical family, a typical household, actually goes out and buys every month. Yeah, this breaks it down perfectly. So first, the government literally goes out and surveys thousands of families to see what they're spending their money on. What are people actually buying? Then, based on all that data, they create this fixed basket of goods and services. Everything from gas and groceries to rent and movie tickets. From there, it's pretty straightforward. They just track the total price of that exact same basket month after month, year after year. And that percentage change in the price of the basket, boom, that's your official inflation rate, the one you hear about as the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. Okay, so we get what it is and how we measure it, but why? What's actually making all these prices go up in the first place? Well, economists usually boil it down to three main culprits. First up, you've got demand pull inflation. The easiest way to think about this is too much money chasing too few goods. It's like a huge auction where everyone wants the same stuff, so they just keep bidding the prices higher and higher. Then you have cost push. This is when the cost of making things goes up. So maybe there's a huge spike in the price of oil. Businesses have to pay more, and guess what? They pass that cost right on to us. And finally, the big one, the money supply itself. When a government just starts printing a ton of new money, it makes every dollar that's already out there less valuable. Now, normally, these three forces are kept in some kind of delicate balance. But what happens when that balance is totally thrown off? What happens when inflation isn't just a few percent, but thousands or even billions of percent? Well, that's when you get into this absolutely terrifying territory called hyperinflation. And there's actually a technical definition for this. An economist defined it as when prices go up by more than 50% in a single month. Think about that. At that speed, your money basically becomes worthless, like overnight. So let's jump back to that story about Germany. After World War I, Germany was buried in war debt, so the government did the one thing it could. It started printing money. A lot of money. And the result was this insane, vicious cycle. In 1922, a loaf of bread was 163 marks. A little over a year later, that same loaf was 200 billion marks. Prices were doubling every 3 or 4 days. People's entire life savings just gone. Poof. Wiped out in a matter of weeks. And it's crazy. As mind-blowing as the German story is, it's not even the world record. Nope. That title goes to Hungary. Back in July of 1946, they hit a monthly inflation rate of 4.19 quadrillion percent. I mean, that's a number my brain can't even really process. At that point, prices weren't doubling every few days, they were doubling every 15 hours. Okay, so those stories are absolutely terrifying. But they're also the reason why modern economies have these powerful institutions whose entire job is to make sure this stuff never, ever happens again. The goal isn't to get rid of inflation completely, but to keep it on a leash, to tame the beast. And that massive job falls to a country's central bank. Here in the US, you've probably heard of it. It's the Federal Reserve, or the Fed. And their main mission, their number one job, is to keep prices stable, which is just a fancy way of saying keep inflation under control. So, how do they actually do that? Everything they do is part of what's called monetary policy. And their biggest, most powerful tool is setting interest rates. If inflation is getting too hot, they can raise interest rates. That makes it more expensive to borrow money, which cools down spending, and that slows down inflation. They can also do other things like buying and selling government bonds to tweak the amount of money flowing through the economy. It's all these tools working together that lets them, try to keep the ship steady. And this is why it's so important. See, when inflation is high and all over the place, it's like poison for the economy. Nobody can plan, your savings get destroyed, it's just chaos. But when you have low, stable inflation, everything just works better. It creates a predictable environment where businesses can invest and people can save for the future with some confidence. All right, so we've looked at the massive, big picture stuff. Hyperinflation, central banks. Now let's zoom all the way back in and talk about what this means for your wallet. You've probably heard this number thrown around on the news before, 2%. That's because most central banks, including the Fed, have basically decided that the Goldilocks number, the sweet spot for inflation, is right around 2% a year. Notice it's not zero. A little bit of inflation is actually seen as a good thing. It's a sign the economy is growing. And that stable 2% target, it has a huge direct impact on your life for a few big reasons. For one, it protects your savings. It means the money you stash away isn't going to be worthless in 10 years. It also gives you a benchmark for your salary. For your wages to actually grow, they need to be rising faster than that 2% inflation rate. It's also crucial for investing. Any investment you make has to beat that 2% mark just to break even. And maybe most importantly, it just creates a predictable future. It makes it possible to actually plan for those huge life goals, like buying a house or retiring, without the rules constantly changing on you. So, at the end of the day, inflation isn't just some abstract number you hear about on TV. It is a real, fundamental force that is always, always working on your money, your savings, your paycheck, your investments. So the real question isn't just, what is inflation? The question is, now that you know how it works, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to factor this into your own financial future?